I noticed something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law set the plate in front of me. Everyone else at the table had roast chicken, golden skin, herbs, the good kind that takes 3 hours. My son had carved it himself, standing at the counter looking proud. My granddaughter had clapped her hands when she saw it. And when my daughter-in-law finally brought something to where I was sitting, it was last Tuesday's soup. Reheated. In the pot it had been stored in. She didn't even pour it into a bowl. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at my son. He was already laughing at something his wife had said. He hadn't noticed, or he had noticed and decided not to. I picked up my spoon and I ate my soup. I didn't say anything, but I thought about it the entire drive home, the entire night, and all through the next morning while I stood at my kitchen window watching the birch trees in my backyard lose the last of their leaves. I am 67 years old. I was a nurse for 31 years at St. Joseph's in Hamilton. I raised 2 children, my son Gordon and my daughter Philippa, mostly on my own after their father passed when Gordon was 11. I worked double shifts at Christmas so my kids could have gifts under the tree. I packed lunches every single day until they left for university. I didn't ask for medals. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I know what it is to put other people first, and I know the difference between choosing to do that and being expected to. Gordon was always the softer one. Philippa could argue with a brick wall and win, but Gordon, he needed to feel needed. When he was small, he used to bring me drawings and stand there with this look on his face until I said something kind about them. He was 41 years old, and that part of him hadn't really changed, which is how he ended up marrying a woman like Sherry. I want to be fair about Sherry. In the beginning, she was fine. She was organized, confident, the kind of person who always seemed to know what she wanted. Gordon was dazzled by that. After years of going back and forth with himself about everything, here was someone who just decided things. I understood the appeal. What I didn't understand until much later was that Sherry's certainty mostly applied to what she wanted for herself. They got married 5 years ago, a nice wedding in Niagara-on-the-Lake, outdoor ceremony, late September, the trees just starting to turn. I cried, genuinely. I thought, here's my son, finally settled. The first time they asked me for money, Gordon called it a loan. They had found a house in Oakville, more than they could afford, but Sherry had her heart set on the neighborhood. The down payment was short by $30,000. Could I help? Just temporarily, just until Gordon's bonus came through in the spring. I transferred the $30,000. The bonus came. I never heard about the money again. When I mentioned it gently 6 months later, Gordon said he thought they'd already discussed that it wasn't really a loan, that it was more of a gift given the circumstances. I didn't remember that conversation, but I let it go. Then it was the car. Sherry's lease was up and she wanted something newer. They were a bit stretched that month. Could I put it on my credit card and they'd e-transfer me back within 2 weeks? I did. The 2 weeks became a month. The month became 3. And when I finally asked, Sherry said she'd thought Gordon had taken care of it. Gordon said he'd thought Sherry had $4,200. I let that go too. My pension is not small. I worked my whole life. I was careful. I own my house outright. I am not a woman who needs to count every dollar. But there is a difference between generosity and being quietly bled, and it took me longer than I would like to admit to name what was happening. What I noticed slowly was that the more I gave, the less they seemed to see me. Not Gordon alone. Gordon still called, still hugged me when I arrived, still introduced me to people as my mom. She's brilliant. But in the daily texture of family life, I had become a resource more than a person. I was the one who watched their dog when they went to Banff. I was the one who brought freezer meals when Sherry had her gallbladder out. I was the one who stayed an extra 2 hours after Sunday dinner to help clean up while Sherry went upstairs to decompress. And I was the one, apparently, who got the reheated soup. I think about the night differently now than I did when it happened. At the time, I told myself Sherry had just been disorganized, that she'd forgotten to make enough, that it wasn't intentional. I made excuses for her the way you do when accepting the truth would mean having to act on it. But sitting at my kitchen table the next morning, watching the light change over the yard, I let myself be honest. It wasn't disorganization. There had been a full chicken, plenty of it. She had made a choice about who got the good dinner and who got what was left. And my son had looked the other way. I'm not a dramatic woman. I don't make scenes. I went through 31 years of nursing. I've held the hands of people dying alone. I've told families things that broke them. I've kept my face calm when everything inside me was not. I know how to stay steady. But steadiness is not the same as acceptance, and that morning I understood that I had been confusing the two for a long time. I called my daughter Philippa. She lives in Victoria now, married to a woman named Ruth, and they have a comfortable, organized, sensible life that I deeply admire. Philippa had been patient with me on this subject for years. She'd said things carefully that I hadn't been ready to hear. But when I called her that morning and told her about the soup, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mum, what are you going to do?" Not "I told you so." Not a lecture. Just, "What are you going to do?" I told her I needed to think. What I thought about over the next several days was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of person who schemes. What I thought about was simply what my life had become and whether I was willing to keep living it that way. I thought about the trip to Portugal I had promised myself after I retired, that I kept postponing because Gordon and Sherry always seemed to need something in the weeks I was considering going. I thought about my friend Claudette, who I hadn't seen properly in almost a year because every weekend seemed spoken for with something related to Gordon's household. I thought about the RRSP contribution I had skipped 1 year to help cover a renovation on their kitchen because their contractor had come in over budget. I thought about all the Sundays I had driven to Oakville and cooked and cleaned and been present and warm and had driven home tired and had told myself that this was love, that this was what you do for family. And I thought, maybe. But love is not supposed to leave you eating cold soup alone at the end of the table. The thing that finally moved me to act was not the soup, and not the money, and not any single moment. It was a Thursday afternoon when I stopped by Gordon's house to drop off a birthday gift for my granddaughter. She was turning 7, and found that Sherry had booked her a party at one of those indoor trampoline places with 20 of her school friends, and I hadn't been told. Not forgotten. I had been specifically not invited because, as Gordon explained when I called him later, Sherry felt that having grandparents at children's birthday parties made things more complicated. My granddaughter didn't know I hadn't been invited. She called me that evening, breathless, telling me about the cake and the prizes and her best friend's new shoes. She didn't know anything was wrong. She was 7. That was the part that broke me open a little. That she was so happy and so entirely unaware, and that she loved me without conditions, and that her parents were making decisions designed to slowly push me to the outside. I am her grandmother. I showed up to that child's first breath. I drove to the hospital in a February ice storm, and I held her when she was 4 hours old. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in my bed in the dark, and I went through everything carefully, the way I used to go through a patient chart. Not emotional, just systematic, I thought. What does this actually look like? What have I given, and what has come back? What do I want my life to look like in 5 years? And somewhere around 4 in the morning, with the house quiet and the streetlight coming through the curtain, I made some decisions. I was not going to cut Gordon off. He is my son. That is not negotiable. But I was going to stop arranging my life around people who had stopped considering me and theirs. In the morning, I called my financial advisor, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Bernadette, who has managed my accounts for 12 years. I told her I wanted to review everything: my will, my investment accounts, my TFSA, the property. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Come in Thursday." What I learned sitting across from Bernadette with a coffee going cold beside me was clarifying. The informal loans, and there had been more than the two I'd been tracking in my head, Bernadette helped me calculate, across everything, came to just under $60,000 over 4 years, not $1 of which had ever been repaid or formally acknowledged. I also learned, because Bernadette is thorough, that Gordon had at some point listed their Oakville home with me as a co-signer in the mortgage renewal, using documents I had signed years earlier that I had not fully understood were still active. I was legally tied to a mortgage on a house I had no claim to, for a family that served me soup from the back of the fridge. I want to say I was surprised. I wasn't. By that point, I had spent enough late nights being honest with myself that this news landed less like a shock and more like confirmation. Bernadette referred me to an estate lawyer named Harold, who was brusque and efficient, and exactly what I needed. Over the following 2 weeks, Harold and I untangled a great deal. The mortgage co-signing situation was addressed through a formal letter. My will was rewritten. My TFSA beneficiary designations were updated. I set up a trust for my granddaughter directly, money that would be available to her for education or housing when she turned 25, administered not through Gordon, but through Philippa. My granddaughter's future was protected. Her parents' access to that future was not automatic. I did not tell Gordon any of this while it was happening. What I did instead was visit. I brought my granddaughter a book she'd been asking for and sat with her for an hour while she showed me how she'd been learning to braid. We ate toast with peanut butter at the kitchen island, and she told me about her teacher and her best friend and a rabbit she'd seen in the schoolyard. It was one of the best hours I'd had in months. Gordon came home while I was there. He seemed surprised to see me. Not unhappy, just slightly off balance, the way people get when a situation doesn't match their expectations. Sherry wasn't home. He made tea, and we sat across from each other, and he talked, and I listened, and I noticed the things he said and the things he didn't say. He didn't mention the party. He didn't mention any of the money. He talked about a project at work that was frustrating him, about a weekend they were planning in Muskoka, about how my granddaughter was doing in school. He was warm and present in the way he always was when it was just the two of us. And I thought, this is my son. This is still there. The question is, what's obscuring it? I didn't say anything that day about what I'd been doing. I wasn't ready, and it wasn't the right moment. I hugged him when I left, and I told him I loved him, because I do. And I drove home thinking the conversation I had been waiting for happened not because I initiated it, but because my granddaughter did. She had apparently decided on her own to draw me a birthday card, not my birthday, just a card, the way children do when they love someone and want to tell them. And she had written inside it that I was her favorite person and that she was sorry I didn't come to her birthday party and that she had saved me a piece of cake in the freezer. Gordon found the card. He asked her about it, and she, being 7 and honest, told him she'd been sad I wasn't there and that she had asked Mummy why, and Mummy had said that grandmas were better at smaller visits. He called me that evening. He sounded strange. Not angry, not defensive, just strange. Quiet. He asked if I had known I hadn't been invited to the party. I said yes. He asked why I hadn't said anything. I said I was waiting to see what he would do when he found out. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Mum, I didn't know. I believed him." That was the hardest part. Believing him and also knowing that not knowing was itself a kind of choice. That he had built a life in which his wife made decisions like that, and he genuinely wasn't paying enough attention to notice. I told him about the party. I told him about the soup. I didn't tell him about the money or the lawyer. Not yet, not all of it. But I told him about the soup, and I told him how it had felt, and I told him about the trip to Portugal I had never taken, and about Claudette, and about Sundays spent cooking and cleaning and driving home tired. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've let things happen that I shouldn't have let happen." That was it, not dramatic, just honest. "I know," I said. We talked for 2 hours that night. Not about solutions, just about what had become true. Gordon told me things he had been pushing down, that Sherry managed most of the household decisions, and that he had been telling himself that was fine because she was good at it, that he had stopped questioning things to avoid conflict, that somewhere in the middle of all of it he had stopped noticing what I was experiencing. He cried at one point, briefly, and I let him. I told him I wasn't trying to make him choose. I told him I loved Sherry because she had given me my granddaughter, and because she made my son feel chosen, and because I was not interested in breaking up my son's marriage. But I told him that things needed to change, and that I was no longer willing to pretend they didn't need to. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted to be invited to things. I wanted to be treated like a person who mattered. I wanted someone to ask, once in a while, how I was doing, and to mean it. I wanted to not be afraid that my generosity was being taken as a signal that I had no limits. He said, "That's not a lot to ask." I said, "No, it isn't." Things did not change overnight. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like mine are often tidied up at the end in ways that aren't quite real. Gordon and Sherry had a hard few weeks. I don't know exactly what was said between them, and I didn't ask. What I do know is that Sherry called me one Sunday afternoon and asked if she could come by for a coffee, just the two of us. She came. She sat at my kitchen table, and she was not the version of herself that I had grown used to. She was quieter, more uncertain. She didn't apologize dramatically. She said she thought she had gotten into habits that weren't fair, and that she hadn't thought carefully enough about how I was feeling, and that she didn't want her daughter growing up not knowing her grandmother. I appreciated that she came. I told her so. I'm not going to tell you that everything is easy now, or that the past 5 years have been repaired in a single conversation. That would be a lie. What I will tell you is that the last dinner I had at Gordon's house, I was handed the first plate. My granddaughter sat beside me and showed me the origami rabbit she'd been learning to fold, and got peanut butter on my sleeve and didn't notice. Gordon cleaned up afterward without being asked. Sherry told a story about a colleague that made me laugh. It was just dinner, but it was dinner at the table, and I had a full plate, and I felt like myself. I still have the card my granddaughter drew. I've kept it on my refrigerator since the day Gordon drove it over. He brought it himself in an envelope with a note in his own handwriting that said simply, "She's right. You are. I booked Portugal for October. Claudette is coming with me. We are going to eat extremely well and drink good wine and walk along the coast and not apologize to anyone for being exactly where we are." I spent a long time believing that love meant making yourself smaller so other people could feel bigger. I don't believe that anymore. Love, I think, is something you can only really give from a place of wholeness. You can't pour from a cup that keeps being handed back empty. I know that now. I learned it late, in my kitchen, on a morning when the birch trees were bare, and I was 67 years old, and finally, quietly, done. There's a moment somewhere in your 60s when you realize that patience and passivity are not the same thing, and that you have spent a long time mistaking one for the other. I think about the soup a lot, not with bitterness anymore, but with something closer to gratitude, which I know sounds strange. That cold bowl of reheated nothing was the clearest mirror I'd looked into in years. It showed me exactly what I had allowed my life to become, and exactly what I had allowed my life to become, and exactly what I needed to change. What I understand now is that the situation with Gordon and Sherry didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most things do, gradually, in small steps that each seemed reasonable on their own. The first loan felt like love. The second felt like family obligation. By the time Sherry was booking my granddaughter's birthday party without telling me, I had been so thoroughly trained to accept less that I almost let that go too. That's the quiet danger of being a generous person. You can slowly teach the people around you that your generosity has no floor. I don't say that to blame myself. I say it because understanding how something happened is the only honest way to change it. When I finally sat with Bernadette and looked at the actual numbers, $60,000, 4 years, not $1 repaid, I wasn't angry at Gordon. I was clear. There is a difference. Anger is loud and it scatters. Clarity is quiet and it moves. What I had to find in those early morning hours with the house dark and my mind finally honest was the courage to act on what I already knew. That's the part nobody talks about. Knowing something is one thing. Doing something about it, especially when it involves your own child, your own granddaughter, your own deeply held belief that family means endurance, that takes something different. It takes a willingness to be uncomfortable in the short term for the sake of what's true in the long term. Gordon needed to hear things I had been protecting him from hearing, and I needed to stop protecting him from the consequences of choices he was making. My granddaughter is the one who cracked it open in the end, not because she was wise beyond her years. She's 7, she just wanted her grandmother at her birthday, but because she was honest in the way children are before they learn to smooth things over. She saved me a piece of cake in the freezer. She wrote that I was her favorite person. She didn't calculate the cost of saying so. That kind of straightforwardness, that willingness to simply say what is true, I had lost that somewhere along the way, and she handed it back to me without even knowing she'd done it. What I hope when I think about Philippa asking me, "What are you going to do?" and about Gordon crying quietly on the phone, and about Sherry sitting at my kitchen table, less certain than I had ever seen her, is that something real shifted for all of us. Not a fairy tale, a reckoning followed by a choice to do better. I'm going to Portugal in October. I have a full passport and a good friend and a table booked at a restaurant in Lisbon where I've been told the salt cod is extraordinary. I'm going because I spent 5 years postponing my own life, and I'm done with that now. The card is still on my refrigerator. It will stay there.